Hi, everyone. It is so good to see you today under different circumstances than when we were all together on September 10th and 11th of 2001 in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And if I recall correctly, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, I believe this was the first in-person meeting of representatives from Safe States Alliance and the Society for the Advancement of Violence and Injury Research. And I know both of our organizations have different names than we did at that time. But as I recall, we were there to establish the National Training Initiative for Injury and Violence Prevention and to begin the process to define the essential knowledge and skills that injury and violence prevention professionals need. At that meeting, we also had representatives from Children's Safety Network, as well as Indian Health Service. So it wasn't just our two organizations, SAVOR and Safe States. And then at different times during the life of NTI, I believe we had representatives from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, as well as others. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to think back on the time in our meeting, our very first meeting on Monday, September the 10th, 2001. And tell me what you think or what you were hoping we would accomplish before we left Chapel Hill on September 11th.
If memory serves, I think what we were hoping for is to create core values and expectations for what injury prevention should be. I think we've come a long way and done a lot of that, but I think that some of the circumstances of those 2 days were quite an hindrance for what we wanted to do. So for me, it's hard to separate the 2 days as to where we ended up, all together. That makes sense?
Yeah, as I recall, I mean, the 10th, we all had dinner at my house and people were just coming into town. And we just started talking about what we were going to do the following day, which was our major first of what was to be several meeting days. And as I recall, I mean, what we were concerned about was the need for a more consistently trained workforce and wanting to develop strategies together to help that happen, whether it was for students who were in training in graduate programs or for people who had already graduated and joined the field and needed a boost in their skills. And as I recall, we didn't really think about developing the core competencies until we were into the meeting itself. And that emerged from our discussion is the way I remember it, but it has been a while ago.
And I think I wanted to make sure there was a good balance of what training researchers needed and what training practitioners needed and how they needed to complement each other.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's my memory, my strongest memory, that I agree with Sue. I was really concerned. I think the uniqueness of New York of having our researchers, our epidemiologists, and our practitioners together was not common in most health departments. And so sometimes these folks didn't even speak to each other, didn't know each other. And I think one of my largest concerns was, how do we make that connection? How do we help people? How do we give them tools so that they can make those connections with each other in their health departments, both state and local?
Yeah, that's one of my clearest memories of the first meeting of us together, was how seamlessly we came together, because we were academics and we were practitioners, but there was a real meeting of the minds very quickly. And I think there was quite a lot of common ground very quickly, which of course got forged the next day.
And I also think it helped that many of us had worked with each other before on different activities, be they research or practice. So I think there was no issue with being open and honest about what we thought or wanted to see.
Well, and I recall that we specifically invited someone from Indian Health Service because of knowing that the program that Rick Smith had developed through IHS a number of years before was a model for how to develop training for injury control professionals, and we wanted to be sure to learn from their experience as we went forward. So that's why Kelly Taylor was there.
So from my perspective, which was solidly in the academic training realm, and there are so many different aspects of training in injury and violence, epidemiology and prevention. Coming into that meeting, it was really, how do you narrow that down? How do you take all of the vast material that's out there in different domains and make it work across disciplines? And I feel that was how we really gelled in terms of listening to each other in our discussions and identifying what were core things that really should be there for everybody. And especially someone new coming into the field. I remember us really piecing out that component, because at that time, and you can correct me now, maybe it's not any different, but there was a lot of folks coming into this discipline of injury and violence prevention who moved from another area like chronic disease or infectious disease and had no understanding of what injury and violence prevention was.
Or even, Tom, another field of where injury and violence prevention was practiced in not the way that we all were necessarily thinking about it. So for my own profession as an occupational therapist, we did a lot of injury prevention, and I don't know that we thought of it in that way. We didn't use those terms. And so there were a whole cadre of professionals that were probably doing a lot of things that we would like to see people do, but not necessarily identifying them as a whole, as part of public health, as part of just medical practice, if you will. And I think that helped look at what are the critical pieces that go into that and how can they be used. So.
Alex, as I recall, you and Carol chaired that meeting. Anything you want to add to this discussion so far?
As I'm listening to you all, I'm realizing that to some extent, what happened on Tuesday has given me a little bit of retrograde amnesia about what happened on Monday, which is common in traumatic events. But the one thing that is trying to come to the front of my mind is the issue of how would training in injury prevention be any different from training in public health in general? And what is peculiar, specific about preventing injury that's unique and not necessarily something's going to learn in someone's going to learn in their MPH program or wherever they trained.
I actually had some of the same thought you did, Alex. When I was trying to put together just some questions for this call, it was like, okay, what do I remember about September the 10th? And honestly, what I remember about it is the dinner that Carol and Des Runyon hosted for us, and just being in the room and getting to know everyone. Let me ask you this. As we came back on September the 11th, and again, I have varied remembrances of that day and how things unfolded. But I think what I remember is at some point very early on, Carol being called out of the room by one of her staff, and then coming back in and telling us what had happened. And honestly, I don't remember if it was I think it was when the first plane hit the World Trade Center. But what are your remembrances of September 11th? Because pretty quickly we stopped working. We tried to continue to work after we heard
Right.
the first plane had hit, but then we pretty much stopped working.
I was just going to add that I remember we got a lot accomplished on Monday, and coming into Tuesday was really trying, I thought, to fine tune based on what we had done on the previous Monday. And we clearly had work to do on that Tuesday, but we really made a lot of ground and progress in that Monday session.
Yeah, and I remember us agreeing to start early, even though we'd been out with Carol in the evening. I remember us agreeing to get going and start early so that we could make progress. And that's why we were all already settled around the table at the time of the attack.
Well, and I think a lot of us had planes to catch that afternoon as well. I don't think we were going to go all day. I thought it was going to be like half a day or something like that. And then we were all ready to hit the road, which amazingly enough didn't happen.
Sue, I was just going to say that when Carol's staff person came into the room and said what had happened, we all kind of like, are you kidding me? This has to be a horrible accident, and it couldn't be anything more than that. And we all ran into the secretary's office and watched the second plane hit. And that was when we realized this was no accident. Pardon me, Mark Rosenberg. I remember your secretary, or one of the secretarial staff, Carol, who was really helping us all try to figure out how we were going to get out of there. And I think, Sue, we got one of the last vehicles available, a van. Everything just sort of has stopped at that point for me. And, it's like, for me, it just sort of shifted from something to productive to some survival issues.
I just had another thought as Ellen was talking, because I would have repeated much of what she said, but I remember like maybe an hour or so just kind of glued to the TV and what was going on and being in disbelief. And then when we sort of switched mode to how are we going to go home, I just started thinking about my family. And I really wanted to be close to my limited family,
Mm-hmm.
and that was very hard because it was like, hey, I'm in Boston and we're in North Carolina, and there's quite a distance, but it was like I immediately wanted to see some of my family. I don't know if anyone else had that thought.
Well, I remember, I think I'd shared with you that my husband coincidentally was at an emergency preparedness meeting near BWI that day. And so I stepped out and called him. And I remember being quite upset because he said that the Air Force had planes up in the air to shoot down anything that went near DC. And I remember him saying, if you want to get home, book a car now because everything's going to shut down. And I hadn't been as shocked when we heard the news. I mean, obviously I was devastated, but having grown up for many years in South Africa, I was not unaccustomed to attacks on home soil. But that idea of the sort of mobilization around DC was it made it very real very quickly. The other thing I remember about you, Sue, was that you had left your glasses on the plane at Logan the day before, and you were talking about how to get home to your family without your glasses. Remember that?
So in the van was Ellen, Kelly Taylor, who's not in this video, Carolyn, Susan Hardman.
I think it was just the five of you, and Tom and Shelley and Alex were all unable to get home that day.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember, going through DC, being worried if we'd even be able to get close to DC, given what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And then proceeding up to Albany area where Susan was. And then I was going to take the turnpike to Logan Airport where my car was. Little did I know when I arrived that they had moved all the cars out of the airport and taken them to offsite locations. And they had no idea where my car was. And they basically said, make your way home and then come back when, maybe in a couple days we'll have it figured out.
Yeah. And the thing I remember is we stopped at one point somewhere in Virginia or Southern Maryland. I forget where it was, but it was so quiet. We were stopped for quite a while, and no cars came past. We were driving, and the roads were just, remember that? They were just empty.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we were, I think we were all shocked that we could get as far and as close to DC as we were able to. There was no evidence of anything serious going on, except for maybe, a holiday on the road.
I think when I shared the same as Sue, I couldn't get in touch with my daughter because the cell phones weren't working.
Yeah.
And so I felt that panic that I needed to get home. But yet I didn't know what that was going to look like in New York. So my recollection, besides the van and you all letting me sit in the front so I didn't get sick, which I appreciate. Thank you. If I've never thanked you. Was seeing the signs that said New York City is closed. I can still see the signs. It just made me sick. I mean, this is a vibrant city. And then when we stopped at the convenience store or whatever it was to get some snacks, probably. I picked up a copy of the New York Times. They had just dropped it off, which I still have. And I knew they'd be really hard to get and to get a paper copy. So when I got back and, my independent daughter was like, well, of course I was fine. I'm not down there. But, it's hard. It's still hard for me to talk about. I still have trouble with September 11th. I worked in a tower and had to go to work the next day. And there was a lot of scurrying around. The folks coming in, it's a very densely populated tower of 20 some floors, and everybody was quiet. People came to work and people weren't talking. And it was hard to focus. It was, and to take my staff and say, it's okay. It's okay that you can't focus today, and let's talk about this and what this means. And that lasted quite a while, I have to say. And I remember walking to my car one day, and I was walking by this wall, and I thought, what if somebody ran into the tower and it fell on me? I had all these feelings after that, and shared them with some of my friends, not my staff, because they were in their own stress level of trauma. And they said they were having the same, they were just constantly jumping. What's happening? There's an intercom system they hardly ever use, and they would come on and say things. And then we had all these drills about how to get out of the tower if something would happen. And how if you were above the 14th floor, you weren't going to live. No, you weren't going to live. There's no way they could get to you. And that's the commissioner's level 4. And then fast forward about 15 months or so later, I was in a meeting with the commissioner, and he was looking at our data. And this just was frustrating. And he looks at it and he goes, well, what's the peak in homicides in the city in 2001? And I kind of didn't really want to respond. Everybody in the room was kind of like, what do you think that is? And I kind of just said something nice, and he goes, oh, and then there was a big hush. I think it took a long time. We would hear reports from the fire department in the city, as we work closely on some other projects, how they would find body parts. I don't know why they felt compelled to call and tell me that, because then it would just be everything coming back again. Arms, legs, on people would find things. As far as the impact on injury and violence prevention, I think that people initially didn't look at our bureau. And again, I think this is back to them not understanding what we did. It took quite a while for them to say, oh, we should be at the same table. I don't think they knew who to look at and what to do. And there was a lot of upheaval and panic, and it took a really long time. And I often liken it to the Oklahoma City bombings. And I think, life goes on for lots of people in other states that maybe can't relate because they weren't there or they haven't been to New York City. And so when, you know, the anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing comes up, it's kind of like you don't think about it. I don't think you ever live in New York during that time and not think about September 11th.
No,
No, I think, Susan, I think you bring up a lot of really good points, because even to, you know, for the last few weeks or whatever, as Shelley's been putting these things together, and I'm thinking, you know, I really don't have a lot of memory of that other than that feeling of fear and terror and stuff like that. And I didn't even feel it as close being, you know, as far as the Pentagon's concerned, because I'm not as close to the Pentagon and, you know, as you are to the city. That whole process was colored by a horrific activity that ended up resulting in a whole bunch of homicides, you know.
Two comments. One is lighter, which is, this is 2001. We don't have Google Maps or Waze to figure out how to get from North Carolina to all the places we're going and avoid New York City. I don't know who was reading the maps that we got from the rental agency or whatever, but that was a challenge.
It was
So,
probably Carolyn.
well,
okay.
Alex and Tom and I had a little different experience because we had to stay in Chapel Hill. And Tom, I think you were able to get a car to get back to Pennsylvania the next day. I'm not sure, but Alex and I didn't fly out until the weekend. So
That's correct, Shelley. I think it might have been a couple of days, but I was eventually able to get a car. And you just, something that was raised earlier was the quiet. And your drive back was serene. No one's on the road. And it's brought, when the lockdown of the pandemic came a couple of years ago, and I was coming back from Florida, at the same thing, I ran into so much quiet that it reminded me of that drive back after 9/11. Interesting, I was young at that time, and so first major trauma, and I often talk about period effects when I teach now. And for me, I always heard about the period effect of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, but I was too young for that. And so this is really an event that marks many people's lives. And for me, it was a clear recognition that the reactions that people have in disastrous scenarios, they're all very different. And recognizing that there are these different reactions and realizing that was a great learning opportunity for me, in the sense that if we're dealing with the public, we need to understand just the diversity of our public in terms of how they deal with disaster situations. So an important takeaway, I grew so much in that period of time from that.
And I never realized how important emergency medical services was until that event. I mean, I always thought they were important. I was aware of what they did, but, you know, the fire and the EMS were absolutely the most courageous people I can ever think of in my life. And just the importance of what they do.
There's something I know I'll have in my memory forever. And that is Friday, when I was finally able to get a flight out of North Carolina, and 4 stops later, finally land in Sacramento. But in the waiting area before we boarded the flight, it was Southwest Airlines, I think. A lot of us were just, you know, quiet. There wasn't a lot of exchange or conversation. And I was looking out the window and saw a man in a uniform walking up the stairs to go into the jetway. And I remember thinking, wait a minute, in this emergency, I thought I heard a declaration that no one would be allowed to do that, and that everyone, including the crew, would have to go through the same boarding process as we did, just for safety's sake, I guess. And I was trying to decide if I should say something to someone. He was in a uniform.
Mm.
For all I knew, he was the pilot. I mean, I had no idea. But he was carrying his travel bag like every self-respecting airline employee does. And I'm thinking, is there something wrong with this picture? Or he must know more about this than I do. I remember it to this day, and I'm sure I always will. It worked out all right, but there were a few harrowing moments there.
Well, I think one of the things that I remember most is just the how gracious Carol, Wanda Hunter, and everybody in North Carolina were. I know that Carol took us to dinner. Carol and Des took us to dinner one night. Another day, I think Wanda Hunter took me to go shopping because, you know, one of the few times that I didn't overpack. And so, you know, it's just how wonderful the folks in North Carolina were to me, and I think to all of us. I have one last question. What do you know now that you wish we had known then?
It's funny, the one thing that's occurring to me is the notion that what feels like your normal day-to-day life is much more precarious than you ever imagined. And that everyone around you feels the same way. Things as big as closing down the entire airspace of the United States can happen in a matter of hours, if not less. And how do you deal with it? How does the person next to you deal with it? It also brings out the remarkable, but in retrospect, not surprising, kindness that you experience from others. If memory serves, I checked out of my hotel and wound up staying at Carol's for several nights before finally being able to fly out late on Friday. And I'm just eternally grateful for that. It made the experience so much more tolerable and calm.
I think that's sort of how I'm feeling about the group of people too, is that we are always, or have been for a long time, been around to support each other, back each other up. And I think that's one of the really great things about the field.
You know, one thing I remember afterward, and I can't remember, maybe it was Shelley, it would send an email out for a number of years on that day to all of us that, you know, had been there or in the car or what, I can't remember. That trip up, as lonely and frightening as it was a time I will never forget, being with people that I wasn't alone. And I can't imagine being alone and going through that. I think afterwards I had similar feelings as Alex does, is that in just a split second, everything can change. And so I need to, on a personal level, and I needed to do this with people I worked with, is talk about the value of friendships and empathy and caring for each other and supporting each other. It made my friendships with other people deeper. I spent more time. I wasn't so busy trying to just plow ahead and get my to-do list done. So I really appreciated those emails and that catch up over time. Also, and I know everybody has heard this, but New York City changed tremendously. The communication between the different units finally was rectified. It had been so just all over the place, and people are so territorial, and we don't work with these people, and they don't, we don't like them, and blah blah blah, and they fixed all that. I mean, it's still fixed. If you've been back to the city, there is a much safer feel there now. And I think a lot of it is because we know that the fire department is talking to the police department. Yes, they have their problems. Every city has their problems. New York's no different. But there's a reassurance there that if something were to happen again, there would be a response that was more coordinated. And so that was one good thing. And hopefully a model for other cities or a lesson so that they could do that.
It's funny if we're looking at what we're now saying, is that we are so impacted by that event that what we're talking about is not so much what we've learned and what we may do differently in the future or whatever, but more constantly we're looking at how did that impact us at that time. It scares me that we haven't learned enough from that kind of an event.
But I'd say, Ellen, that episode brought everyone together for a brief amount of time. It is possible to bring people together. I think that is still a core element of us as a human race. Not that it's easy to do, and not that you want a disaster to occur for that to take place, but it is with work, it is possible to really have people all on the same page. I think that's something I never realized could exist before 9/11. The second issue is the importance of leadership in a scenario like that. And that really struck home. Carol and her staff really rose to the challenge at that point in time. The leadership that she provided was outstanding, and it really made a difference for us, but it highlights the real importance of leadership, strong leadership in situations like that.
Well, thank you. What I was going to say was, I think sort of echoing some of what several of you were saying is that one of the things that having gone through this horrible experience together, I think it did strengthen the relationships within our group, both personally, but also professionally. And I think, we all know that over the years, there are sometimes tensions between, the academic and the practice communities, and who's getting more money for this or that, or who's coming at it from a different perspective. And I think that, while that's always going to be there to a certain extent, I think that going through this experience together, I think cemented some of our relationships and allowed us to move forward in subsequent meetings that weren't in person, to continue to build what we had started building in September. And I think, we should all take pride in that.
At the time, there was, for so many Americans, this was their first experience of this kind of trauma. Obviously, millions of our fellow Americans have had all sorts of reasons and so much trauma, but this was a sort of a unifying trauma. And when I look back at our field now, I think there was, especially with those of us who grew up in incredible privilege, it was easy, I think, for us at the time to forget the impact of trauma on us, on injury, on health, on communities. And I don't know to what extent 9/11 was one of the catalysts for that, but I think it's something that in our injury and violence prevention field, we don't ignore anymore. I think we're very attuned to issues such as structural racism, structural inequity, the impacts of trauma on communities now.
And yet, as I was listening to Tom talk about the ways in which good things seem to emerge out of very bad things. A cautious note always comes up for me, which is that for a period of time, this togetherness is extraordinary. And then it fades. And there's no telling how long that's going to take or whether it's going to be the same every place. But it doesn't last long enough, usually, for something structural to come out of it, especially in a society like ours where decisions take a long time to implement, let alone evaluate. I remember up until a few years before we got together in Chapel Hill, I had the Department of Health emergency coordinator reporting to me in my branch. And it was an interesting juxtaposition of responsibilities for prevention and responsibilities for response, all being in the same unit, small as it was. But some of that stuck with me, and it wasn't until several years later that I heard, I think at an APHA conference, one of our colleagues from Canada, and I remember his first name was Jake, but I can't remember his last name, gave a talk about the fact that in between the first small attack on the Twin Towers several years earlier and the huge one on September 11th, incredible changes were made structurally and functionally in those towers, including regular fire drills, which brought the evacuation time down from over 5 hours to less than 2 hours. And to think in retrospect about how many lives were saved because of that. Yes, it was an extreme, horrific tragedy, and it could have been worse because a few people realized that something could be done to make things better. Architects, emergency response officials, building managers, fire departments, et cetera, and that really is the lasting benefit of some of these traumas that nowadays I think are much harder to do because everything's moving faster. We had some earthquakes in California around that period of time, the 90s and early 2000s. And it was astounding how quickly the political coattails of those events got shorter and shorter and shorter as time went on, to the point where even though we tried very hard to use these examples to try and improve the ability and the capacity of our programs to handle them, after the Loma Prieta earthquake during the World Series in 1989, the political coattails for that event were about 48 hours long. And after that, nobody wanted to hear about improvements in emergency preparedness. I mean, that was quick. And I think it probably even quicker now.
Sue, do you have, not to put you on the spot, but do you have any final comments before we close this out?
Don't sweat the small stuff. Remember how that book came out? But honestly, it's like we were in this traumatic event. And I think my perspective changed on a lot of other things that I thought were awful or annoying or whatever. I don't know where that came from, but don't sweat the small stuff.
that it's really important to learn from the history, not only history
Mhm.
generically, but the history of our field and what has come before, and try to capitalize on the mistakes that those before us and before them have made, and to not make the same mistakes again, but make new ones as new things. But I think sometimes we forget to kind of pay attention to what came before. That's really important.
Mhm.
One other word that comes to mind is advocacy, because for years, you know, there's been, well, before that, there had been a lot of discussion about changing building codes and standards, because
Mhm.
many were created many years before and didn't really fit with the current way things were built and developed. And, you know, things go unheard all the time in our injury and violence prevention messages. But I'm thinking, you have to take advantage of adverse events and use that to do advocacy.
Mhm. Mhm.
And on that note, I will end by saying that this was a horrific event, but I can't think of a group of people that I would have rather been with on September 11th and to go through this with. So want to thank you all for being here today. Thank you for your continued work and your continued commitment to injury and violence prevention. I miss seeing you guys, but you're always in my heart, my friends. Thank you.
Thank you.
Likewise.